Elizabeth had never told anyone about her secret. She knew most people wouldn't understand, and how could she explain something that went beyond the ordinary? After her mother's death, Lizzie didn't feel lonely, because her mother stayed close. She could feel her presence, hear the faint footsteps in the empty room, the almost imperceptible scent of jasmine that always clung to her hair. Sometimes in the mornings, Lizzie would feel gentle fingers brushing a lock of hair from her face, just like her mother had done when waking her as a child. Years passed, but that feeling never faded. Lizzie had grown accustomed to it, like the wind's breath or sunlight, and she never doubted. Her mother continued to watch over her. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, when the rain softly tapped against the window, she would hear someone softly whisper her name. Lizzie wasn't scared. On the contrary, the voice brought her comfort, just like when her mother used to read her bedtime stories. She could almost feel the warmth of her mother's hand, those tender touches. Lizzie's life flowed steadily on. She lived in a small house in the old part of Charleston, a city where the past never completely fades. Narrow streets, shaded alleys, centuries-old oak trees draped with moss, everything here held stories, just like she did. Her home had once belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and now it was hers. The wooden floors creaked, and the walls seemed to breathe with the memories of the past. Lizzie liked to think of the house as a thread connecting generations, with her mother simply becoming part of that connection. But sometimes, especially on rainy autumn evenings, Lizzie felt something more than just presence. It was sometimes a nearly tangible chill that ran across her skin, like an invisible hand brushing her shoulder. At times, her dreams were so vivid that she would wake up with the feeling that her mother had just been sitting next to her, her warm hand still lingering on her wrist. Lizzie didn't try to find explanations, she simply lived with it, not telling anyone. Her co-workers at the antique shop she managed noticed that sometimes she seemed to drift off, as though listening to someone invisible. "Lost in thought again, Lizzie?" Her friend Marion would ask with a smile. "Yeah, just remembering something," Lizzie would reply, though in reality she wasn't remembering, she was listening. Sometimes her mother spoke to her, not in words, but in sensations, memories, strange coincidences that couldn't be explained away as chance. But one cold November evening, something happened that changed everything. Lizzie was sitting in the living room with a cup of hot tea when the old wall clock, long broken, suddenly rang with a clear, sharp chime. Her heart froze. The clock hadn't worked in over 10 years, and now, it had marked the beginning of something new. She rose from the couch and slowly approached the clock. A faint scent of jasmine filled the room, and in that moment, Lizzie realized her mother was trying to tell her something. But what was it? Every morning, Lizzie Rendell would hop on the subway heading to the university, and every time, one person always caught her attention. Tall, dark-haired with a casual air about him, but a warm, friendly smile, he always sat across from her. Their eyes would meet, but neither of them ever had the nerve to speak first. For weeks they played this silent game of glances, until one day, he finally took the leap. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "We see each other here so often, I figured it was time we introduced ourselves. I'm Daniel." "Lizzie," she replied, offering a slightly shy smile. "Yeah, it seems like the subway has turned into our personal meeting club." That's how their conversation started. He turned out to be not just good-looking but also surprisingly easy to talk to, witty and kind. Daniel was studying art history and worked at a small gallery downtown. He spoke about paintings with such enthusiasm that, as Lizzie listened, she felt her whole day light up. Gradually, their conversations grew more personal. They talked about books, childhood memories, dreams, and fears. Lizzie couldn't remember the last time she'd been able to speak so freely with someone, like she'd known him forever. But something troubled her. Without realizing it, Lizzie started to notice that since Daniel had come into her life, something that had always been there, her mother, was now gone. There were no more light footsteps in an empty room, no familiar scent of jasmine in the air, no soft morning touch. The world that had always been a comfort to her suddenly vanished, leaving an emptiness behind. She told herself it was just a coincidence that her mind had simply let go of the past, allowing her to move forward. But deep down, something whispered to her that it wasn't. She felt a loss, and it was too real to be just a coincidence. One evening, Daniel offered to walk her home. The streetlights had already flickered on, and a light autumn breeze was drifting through the streets, filling the air with the smell of wet leaves. They walked through the narrow alleys of Charleston, and at some point, Lizzie felt a strange chill run down her spine. It was a familiar sensation, but now it felt distant and unsettling. She glanced at Daniel, who was laughing and telling a funny story, but Lizzie no longer heard him. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something important, but she couldn't quite figure out what had changed in her life. Her mother hadn't just disappeared. Something or someone had pushed her out. When they reached her house, Daniel lingered on the porch, looking at her with a hint of expectation. Lizzie hesitated for a moment, but finally forced a smile and thanked him for the pleasant evening. However, as the door closed behind her, her heart tightened with an uneasy premonition. Something wasn't right, and she needed to find out what before it was too late. On Friday evening, Lizzie carefully prepared for her date. Daniel had invited her to a small restaurant by the waterfront, and she wanted to look perfect. She chose her favorite dark blue dress, neatly styled her hair, applied a light touch of makeup, and added a dab of jasmine perfume. As she looked in the mirror, she suddenly felt like she saw a shadow move behind her. She spun around quickly. The room was empty. She sighed, trying to calm herself. It was just nerves. Ever since Daniel had come into her life, she felt this constant unease. Like something wasn't right, but Lizzie couldn't figure out what. She kept telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. What the? Lizzie tried again, but the door didn't move an inch. It was like the lock had jammed. Frowning, she walked over to the window. Streetlights were glowing outside, and people strolled slowly along the sidewalk. Everything seemed normal. But as soon as she glanced back at the door, the lamp on the nightstand flickered and went out. Damn, Lizzie muttered, fumbling for her phone. She wanted to text Daniel, but as soon as she turned the screen on, it went blank. The battery was completely dead, even though it had been fully charged that morning. A chill ran down her spine. She rushed to the outlet, plugged in the charger. Nothing. In a panic, Lizzie checked another device. There was no power anywhere in the apartment. Now she was alone in the dark, cut off from the outside world. Her heart raced. Panic spread through her chest. She tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but couldn't. Her gaze landed on the old clock on the wall. It hadn't worked in years, but now, the hands were slowly moving backward. Lizzie gasped and recoiled. She felt it, that presence, familiar and unsettling. A cold shiver ran down her shoulders, making her skin crawl. "Mom?" she whispered. But there was no response. Only the faint scent of jasmine filled the room. It was a warning. Lizzie collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow. Fear, mixed with desperation, overtook her. Why was all of this happening now? Why did she feel like her mother was trying to protect her? But from what? That night, she had a strange dream. She stood on the riverbank, and across from her, shrouded in thick fog, stood her mother. Her face was unclear, but Lizzie knew it was her. "Don't go to him," the voice whispered, barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "Lizzie, please." Her heart tightened with longing and worry. "Mom, what are you trying to say?" She shouted, but the fog enveloped the figure, and her mother vanished. Lizzie woke up in a cold sweat. She knew this wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. But what was she supposed to do now? Chapter 4: Return. Lizzie woke up to a barely noticeable touch on her cheek. Light, like a breath of wind, like a warm hand that used to wake her up as a child. Her heart squeezed and she froze, not opening her eyes, afraid of disturbing the feeling. It was Mom. It was her. The sunlight was already filtering through the curtains, filling the room with a soft, golden glow. Lizzie took a deep breath, expecting the familiar scent of jasmine, but it wasn't there. Yet deep inside, she knew something had changed. Something had returned. She slowly opened her eyes and saw the bedside lamp flicker a few times before glowing steadily with warm light. This light didn't just illuminate the room. It felt alive, comforting, enveloping, as if something invisible was trying to tell her, "I'm here." Lizzie sat up on the bed, a tingling sensation in her fingertips. Her attention was drawn to the phone on the nightstand. It was fully charged, even though it had mysteriously died the day before. Lizzie grabbed it and, without thinking, dialed Daniel's number. The phone rang, but he didn't answer. Strange. He usually called back right away. But the most surprising part wasn't that. Lizzie didn't feel anxious. She didn't feel disappointed or upset. Instead, her heart tightened with a strange sense of foreboding she couldn't explain. She got out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. Something told her today was going to be important. She walked over to the window, pulled the curtain back, and looked out. Fall had fully arrived. The leaves, painted in crimson and gold, slowly swirled in the air, covering the sidewalk in a soft carpet. Lizzie had never noticed how beautiful mornings were at this time of year. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. A warmth spread inside her, almost forgotten, yet familiar. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a presence. Mom? She was back. Lizzie didn't know why, but she felt it was important. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air from the kitchen. Lizzie reached for a cup absent-mindedly, but suddenly her hand froze. There, on the table, lay a pendant. A small silver locket with the letter L engraved on it. It had belonged to her mother. Tears filled her eyes. Lizzie traced her finger along the cold surface, remembering how she used to play with the locket as a child, sitting on her mother's lap. It had disappeared after her death. She searched for it, sifted through boxes of her belongings, but never found it. But here it was, right in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and closed it in her palm. Warmth spread across her skin. Lizzie took a deep breath and closed her eyes. "You're here, aren't you?" she whispered. The room was silent, only the thudding beat of her heart and the distant sounds of the waking city outside the window. But Lizzie knew she had been heard. She tried calling Daniel again. Silence. Something told her that he was no longer part of her future. It was as if her mom was trying to warn her, to stop her from something that could hurt her. And in that moment, Lizzie realized, all this time she hadn't been searching for love or comfort or validation. She had been searching for her mother, searching for a sign that she wasn't alone. And today she had received it. A month had passed. Lizzie's life slowly returned to normal. Days came and went, filled with work, occasional meetups with friends, and lazy evenings in front of the TV. Everything that had happened that strange night when her meeting with Daniel had fallen apart now seemed distant and insignificant. She even started to question whether it had really mattered at all. But the past wasn't ready to let her go so easily. When the phone rang, Lizzie had just returned home from work. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. She hesitated before pressing the answer button. "Miss Rendell?" The man's voice was calm but authoritative. "Yes, this is she," Lizzie replied, alert. "This is Detective Michelson from the police department. We need you to come down to the station. It concerns an ongoing investigation. The sooner, the better." Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. Dozens of questions raced through her mind, but something inside told her that she had to go. The police station was gray and unremarkable, with dim lamps and the lingering smell of coffee absorbed into the walls. Lizzie sat at a small table in Detective Michelson's office, her hands clenched into fists to hide the trembling. Across from her sat Michelson, a man in his 40s with a tired yet attentive gaze. "Do you know a Daniel Hale?" he asked, spreading some papers in front of him. Lizzie swallowed nervously. "Yes. We've met a few times," she answered cautiously. "What's this about?" The detective sighed heavily, leaning in a little closer. "Ms. Rendell, Daniel is a member of a criminal syndicate involved in kidnappings. They use a specific method. They gain the victim's trust, create a sense of safety, and then commit the crime." Lizzie gasped, struggling to catch her breath. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was absurd. "No, that's impossible. He's not like—" Her voice faltered, but the detective shook his head slightly. "We've been watching him for months. He was arrested the night you were supposed to meet him. Seems you were lucky you couldn't leave your house that night." Everything inside Lizzie clenched painfully. That night, the electricity that suddenly went out, the broken phone. She could have become one of those people who are never found again. They would have searched for her, posted on social media, put up flyers on lampposts, but no one would ever know what really happened to her. I need to." Lizzie stood up abruptly. but the room spun around her. "You need time to process this," the detective observed, watching her closely. "But if you remember anything unusual about his behavior, it could help us." Lizzie wanted to say she didn't remember anything, but suddenly, details she hadn't paid attention to before came rushing back. How Daniel always knew where she was, how he had mentioned her neighbor once, even though Lizzie never told him about her. How he asked questions that were odd for someone she barely knew. All of it now formed a chilling picture. I don't know. Maybe. Yes, there were some strange things," she whispered. The detective nodded and handed her his business card. "If you remember anything, give us a call. And be careful, Miss Rendell." Lizzie automatically gripped the cardboard rectangle between her fingers, stood up, and left the office. Inside, it felt as if her life had just been flipped upside down. Now she knew the truth. And that truth was scarier than any of her darkest fears. As Lizzie walked out of the police station, she looked up at the sky. It was already late, the sun nearly gone beyond the horizon, leaving behind soft shades of pink and gold in the sky. A gentle breeze touched her face, bringing with it the familiar scent of jasmine. Her heart froze for a moment, then filled with a warm, barely perceptible feeling. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. The quiet whisper got lost in the evening air, but Lizzie knew her mother was still there. She didn't just feel it, she knew. The scent, the warmth inside her, it was more than just a memory. At home, it was quiet. Too quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of the city was outside her windows, but inside her apartment, there was a thick, almost tangible silence. Lizzie shrugged off her jacket, walked into the living room, and sank into the chair, tiredly rubbing her temples. Her head was buzzing from everything that had happened over the past few days. Daniel. The police. The realization of how close she'd come to the edge. Lizzie closed her eyes, but instead of darkness, the past flickered before her eyes. Childhood. Evenings at her mother's house, the smell of baked goods, her soft voice filling the silence. "You're stronger than you think, sweetie." At the time, those words had seemed like nothing more than comfort, but now they were truth. "You're stronger than you think, Lizzie." The voice echoed in her head so clearly that she opened her eyes. Her heart beat faster. It was impossible, but she felt her presence. Jasmine, that scent again, so familiar, warm, enveloping, like a mother's embrace from childhood. Lizzie took a deep breath, letting the sensations fill her. She no longer felt alone. Several days passed. Lizzie began noticing little signs that had slipped by her before. On the kitchen table, which usually held a mess, her favorite mug was suddenly placed neatly in its spot. In the bedroom, her blanket, crumpled from sleep, was lovingly straightened. On the windowsill, where there hadn't been any flowers for ages, a tiny bud of white jasmine bloomed, even though Lizzie was sure it hadn't been there. Coincidence? Or something more? One evening, as Lizzie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the feeling of unease suddenly faded away. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered again. And in that moment, the wind outside stirred the curtains just a little more, and the familiar scent of jasmine softly filled the room. Lizzie smiled. She knew her guardian angel would always be by her side.